Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Chris Walker, the Executive Director of the International Forum for Democratic Studies at the National Endowment for Democracy, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to our discussion today entitled Finding What Works, Building Reform Coalitions in Brazil. This is a joint initiative of the London-based Legatum Institute with the National Endowment for Democracy's International Forum for Democratic Studies, World Affairs Journal, and Democracy Lab. Today's discussion is the first in a series that will include two other case studies looking at the ingredients that are critical for achieving meaningful economic reform. We're very with us two top experts on political transitions and democratic reform to discuss the case of Brazil, how the country has managed to achieve reform progress, and how it can build upon its successes in the face of a number of serious challenges. They will discuss today the contents of a paper that's just being released. We have copies here available of the same title with the author, Professor Marcus Melo. This series of case studies that we're beginning today is an outgrowth of a fruitful collaboration that we've had with the Legatum Institute looking at the broader topic of democratic reform and political transitions. And we've really been delighted to have this opportunity to work with Anne Applebaum and her colleagues. Given its size and position as a key young democracy, Brazil deserves greater attention, and I'm very pleased that we're able to devote more to it. And on this count, I'd take the opportunity and commend everyone to an excellent report whose U.S. release we hosted here last year, Democracy Works, the Democratic Alternative from the South, that was a project of the Legatum Institute and three partner organizations. This analysis aimed to refresh the development debate and inject the voice of the democratic countries from the South, with a focus on India, South Africa, and Brazil. The findings from that report offered a rebuke to the argument that democracy is a hindrance to growth and demonstrated that the allure of the authoritarian bargain is a false promise. Today's event will enable further examination of the crucial case of Brazil, and we look forward to the discussion between Professor Melo and Anne Applebaum. For those of you who are following on Twitter, you can contribute to the conversation today and follow the discussion by using the hashtag #GoverningBrazil or by following the International Forum for Democratic Studies at Think Democracy and the Legatum Institute at Legatum INST. And now it's my real pleasure to introduce Anne Applebaum.
Thank you very much, Chris, and thank you to the National Endowment for Democracy. It's always a pleasure to be here, and this is as Chris said, is the latest in a series of lectures. This one is the first, as Chris said, in a group of three, which did indeed, as he described, grow out of a project that we did last year on Brazil, India, and South Africa. And the goal of the project was to show, as he said, to refute the argument that you needed an authoritarian regime or some kind of dictatorship in order to achieve economic growth. That economic reforms are somehow only possible, if you have General Pinochet in charge or the Chinese Communist Party. If you look around the world, there are many examples of countries which have had high growth and which have achieved change and which have achieved economic change, not only despite democracy, but because of it. You can point to leaders, you can point to presidents and particular governments that have created coalitions for reform and coalitions which were able to back quite radical economic changes. And the idea of this series was that we thought it would be interesting to look at three of them. I think we're going to look at Brazil, India, and Mexico as examples of democracies that have at times achieved high growth. It was funny, we were just saying before, Brazil is a country that never ever looks at thinks of itself as a model for anything. And certainly, I've never heard a Brazilian who had anything flattering to say about his own government. Nevertheless, it's also the case that other governments do look to Brazil as an example of a developing country which has had an enormous amount of economic success, which has really world-class companies, which has brought a lot of people out of poverty in the last 2 decades. And people from around the world look to Brazil as an example, even though the Brazilians don't. It's actually a phenomenon I know well, being from Poland, which is a country that is also sometimes looked at for different reasons as a model, and never ever would thinks of it that way at home. But that's maybe some kind of, maybe that's very typical. But we're particularly pleased to have Marcus, Professor Marcus Mello was involved in that previous project as well. Delighted that he could come today. He's a professor of political science at the Federal University of Pernambuco and a former Fulbright scholar at MIT. He has taught at Yale, fellow at the Rockefeller Foundation. He's the author of several books, including Making Brazil Work. There's a good title for you. Checking the President in a Multi-Party System, and Beliefs, Leadership, and Critical Transitions, which is going to be published by Princeton in 2015. His paper you can see outside. This is it. It's the colors of the Brazilian flags, just in case you weren't sure which one it was. But what I've asked him to do today is he'll do a very brief introduction to some of the paper, and then I will ask him a few leading friendly questions to get him to talk a little bit more about Brazil, and when Brazil works, why does it work, and how has it worked, and how could it work again? And then I know this is an audience full of Brazil scholars and experts, so then we'll ask for your contributions, not just questions, but comments and contributions as well. So anyway, thank you very much for making the trip here to snowy Washington from Brazil.
Let me start by thanking the Legato Institute and the National Endowment for Democracy and the other sponsors for being here. I'm flattered by the invitation. It's a privilege to address such a distinguished audience. If I were to start situating the current situation in Brazil, there are references now to Brazil's quagmire or Brazil's morass. And we heard that before, right, in the early 1990s. Some 20 years ago, Brazil was regarded as a reform laggard, suffered from the Linsian, I'm referring to the famous political scientist Juan Lins, Linsian nightmare, a combination of presidentialism, multi-party government, predatory federalism. So all things negative made part of that diagnosis of the Brazilian situation. And so, there's an analogy about what is going on now, but my view is radically different. I think that there's a silver lining in what's going on in Brazil, and I actually don't go into great lengths in analyzing the reasons for the silver lining, which has to do primarily with the strength of checks and balances in Brazil. And I think that's crucially important. And also the fact that we've had a strong political competition and power alternation over time along a vibrant press, independent press that sustained and prevent and acted as an important limit, constraint on power abuse and so on. So if I to summarize the reason why Brazil has been successful. But returning to the historical perspective of the 1990s, so Brazil's success under Cardoso was pretty much because the diagnosis at that time was an institutional diagnosis, right? So Brazil didn't work because we had strong presidents, weak parties, a strong federation, powerful governors that acted as barons of the federation and so on. And the result was deadlock, and the idea of a deadlock democracy was very, very strong in that context of the early 1990s. Then Brazil's success proved, and that is something that is valuable from a more general perspective and of interest to other countries, prove that multi-party coalitions can work, and strong presidents also can provide public goods and promote economic development and so on. So this deadly combination of these several institutional components or constitutional components, if you want, proved wrong. And the fact that we had a power alternation and the same model worked under Lula and was also corroborated the forces that was not presidentialism as such and so on, but had to do with coalition management and power, political competition, and other factors that actually were more important than individual aspects of the institutional design. And then now, in the current situation, we have a crisis, and Dilma Rousseff, our president, is currently facing a perfect storm, right, characterized by people in the streets, a corruption scandal, austerity politics, and a fragmented legislature. So this is a combination that has led in other countries in Latin America to impeachment. So that's why there are so many negative things being said about the situation now in Brazil. So, but the silver lining is, since the mensalão in Brazil, right, when
The scandal.
the mensalão scandal, the major scandal in 2005, and that episode is crucial for understanding what's going on now, because it is a lesson that can be drawn from the mensalão. The fact that now many powerful members of the Brazilian elites have been sentenced, and this is truly unprecedented, to have the president of the party of the president in jail. So no other country can, I don't think that this has ever happened in history anywhere. And so this is a significant,
Be proud of.
something to be proud of. Yes.
Can I get you to go back a little bit and to talk just for a minute about Cardozo? I know that, again, this will be a group of people who understand it pretty well, but can you unpack for us a little bit, so you say he created a multi-party coalition for reform. In other words, in a system that was supposed to be dysfunctional when, supposedly it was impossible anything happened in Brazil because of all these conflicts between different interest groups and different political parties. Somehow, in a brief period of time, he overcame that, and he, in many ways transformed, certainly Brazil's finances and other aspects. What were what can you point to 2 or 3 elements of that? I mean, what did he identify a group of potential supporters? What was the basis for that achievement?
Cardozo emerged in a window of opportunity, right? This window of opportunity came out as a result of a mismatch between expectations and outcomes. So the former economic model, had collapsed.
Mhm.
And
There was a crisis.
there was a crisis, and leadership can only be exercised in window of opportunities. So this is a very specific conceptualization of leadership. Lula, for example, was a charismatic leader, but not a defense, because there was no window of opportunity resulting from
A crisis.
From a crisis. So that was crucial for the support that Cardozo had.
So the sense of
from the part
crisis and the
of-
sense.
Yeah.
Were there
it's not-
social groups that he appealed to? Were there, can you point to where did his support come from in the society?
Business elites were a crucial element in that. And the middle class and
So he identified the new middle class as a source of support.
yeah, the so-called new middle class is something that emerged.
Yeah, I
in
was
the
going to say,
last,
sorry,
yeah,
didn't exist. It was much smaller then. Right.
yeah, was much smaller.
Right.
But Cardozo managed to build a coalition that consisted primarily of two parties, the PFL and the PSDB, and along with two more parties, that it was a four-party coalition. And he amassed enormous political support in Congress. And what happened since Cardozo was the increasing fragmentation of coalitions that have become increasingly heterogeneous in their ideological nature. So some metrics for that, and in the literature and so on. So when we use that, we see that this ideological fragment in Brazil has exacerbated to the point that under Lula, you had it was such an unholy alliance because it was under Lula, because you had the PL that was primarily the party of the Church of the Universal of the I'm sorry? Of the Kingdom of God, yeah, which is an extreme right-wing party, and at the same time you had the Communist Party of Brazil in the same coalition. So this, of course, building such coalitions lead to cynicism. So whereas Cardozo managed to build more homogeneous coalitions and not as fragmented as Lula, that was crucial also for his success.
For his credibility.
Yeah.
Can I ask you alluded to this in what you said in the beginning when you said, well, we managed to put some of our top political leaders in jail. What are the elements of, are there, very often, even in Washington, one hears the argument, that democracy is a problem for economic reform. But you alluded to something else, which is that there are elements of the democratic process that were helpful to Cardozo, and actually later to Lula as well. And you talked about the media, which could uncover corruption, and then some of your institutions, which were able to, you have independent judiciary, which is able to make neutral judgments. Am I right in thinking that those are things that actually helped him and then helped his successors to rule?
Yeah. If we focus on the Cardozo first term of office, so we have an answer for that. Or if we look more broadly over the last 20 years. The strength and balances in Brazil has to do with primarily with political competition and political fragmentation. So unlike other countries in Latin America, the presidential races has been the contestation has been intense, and the margins of victory has been slim, with never more than 15%. And in a few cases, like the recent presidential race, Rousseff won by less than 3% of the vote, so 3-4% of the vote. So political competition is crucial because you can only understand the strength of the judiciary if you have in mind the fact that there is sheer composition of the courts. You have pluralism as a result of power alternation, and also the fact that the judiciary, in order to be bold, it has to count on public opinion and has to count on the effect that will have on the opposition as well. So the current, the judge in charge of the current scandal, who has conducted all the investigations and so on, he actually has written a piece, and this is a very interesting piece, on the Mani Puliti, the clean hands operation in Italy. And this has the crucial factor behind the operation. He wrote that some 7 years ago, was the support of the public opinion in Italy. So I think this is a very, very important to...
public support for the independent judiciary can help strengthen the independent judiciary. But it's a...
Yes.
Another thing that we were just talking about this earlier that is, of course, interesting and significant about Brazil is that you had, two political leaders, both very strong, both very different from completely different parts of the political spectrum. Again, in a country that had, prior to that, had a history of instability and military coups and so on. They both completed their terms. They were both considered successful in different ways. You had Cardoso and then Lula. That makes Brazil look like an incredibly stable, politically stable society, because it's not just enough to have, somebody from one party be successful. The fact is, you had two very different people. How do you explain that? How do you explain Brazil's success in having this kind of stability?
One key factor is beliefs, social beliefs. So since the late, during the transition to democracy in the late 80s, we've had two key beliefs that are shared widely in the population. One is in social inclusion. So the Constitution of 1988 encapsulated that beliefs, and there is a near consensus on the importance of social inclusion. So that
the importance of bringing more people into the mainstream, into the political and economic mainstream.
Yeah,
yes.
The importance of redistribution and also of participation. So there's a consensus across the political spectrum on these key beliefs, the beliefs in social inclusion. Since that was combined with another belief that resulted from the experience of hyperinflation and the chaos surrounding the presidencies of Sarney and Collor. And so there's a strong belief in Brazilians on social inclusion, fiscally responsible social inclusion. And so this explained the policy convergence between two rivals, which are the PSDB and the Workers' Party. And in a way, that's there is so much continuity in terms of macroeconomic management that Lula adopted.
He adopted fiscal
Yeah.
responsibility.
The inflation targeting, the flexible exchange rate, and also
So
primary
actually, in
surpluses.
fact, what you're saying is that public opinion was such that it sort of forced the politicians to be good, which is almost the opposite of what people happens. You know.
Yeah. No, usually the diagnostic is purely institutional, right? You say, no, if you have party fragmentation, then it follows that. Or if you have presidentialism and you have a fragmented polity, then that will lead to a unilateralism on the part of the president, a problem of dual legitimacy.
Or the idea is that, you'll have, because you're a democracy, you'll need to hand out, promises to lots of different people, and then you'll have, you'll spend too much and your budget will break and so on. But you're saying that, in fact, because there was this conviction, popular conviction in Brazil, that fiscal responsibility was important, that was at least constrained, that political impulse to hand stuff out.
Yeah, it doesn't mean that pressures for redistribution.
No, I understand, but they had to be fiscally responsible.
Yeah. The very
Up to a
fact
point,
that the but this, what is interesting is that this equilibrium we had was knocked off in 2008, and this has to do with two things. To my the pre-salt oil discovery, the ultra deep, on the one hand, and the other one, the international economic crisis, because that legitimized the strengthening of interventionism and dirigism in the Brazilian economy. So these two elements were external shocks to this equilibrium, and that led the PT to abandon its commitment to the generation of fiscal surpluses.
So the oil discovery was bad for economic policy.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. I
Not
think
the
it
only
was
place.
a form of resource curse that.
It's a
and
sort
the
of
other thing is that
psychological resource curse.
Keynesianism that came out of the 2008 crisis sort of re-legitimized going back to the old ISI, and so that led to a reconfiguration of beliefs on the part of factions within the then current government, and the current crisis is a proof that this experiment has failed.
The experiment of returning to dirigism has failed.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I mean, Rousseff's recent policy switch, is the the best evidence we have to that. So she is returning to the old consensus, the consensus that was established under Cardoso and Lula.
So in other words, and because of
And that's
popular
part of the
outrage.
silver line, and that's important.
So part of the so in fact the public opinion and the pressure of politics has forced Rousseff back to decent economics rather than the other way around. Something more or less.
Yeah, I think so.
I'm sorry, I'm oversimplifying. Why don't we take a few comments? Again, I know there are lots of Brazil experts in the room. What are there observations or yes? Why don't you stand up and introduce yourself?
Hi, Paulo Sotero from the Brazil Institute at the Wilson Center. Thank you very much for the session. I am very delighted to be in the presence of Professor Marcos Mello, not only because he's from Pernambuco, a great scholar. I one thing, Anne, that you mentioned, this business of Brazil and Poland not recognized, being recognized as countries of change, examples, and not recognized. We have a name for this. A famous playwright in Brazil, actually, is the stray dog complex. It's an inferiority complex, okay? And in its most virulent form, it can be very negative because instead of being leading to self-criticism, sometimes it leads to self-flagellation, which is paralyzing and very bad for you. And we are risking having that right now. Now, what I wanted to, and the thing that I find fascinating what's happening now, what Lula did, and he basically, without ever recognizing Cardoso's merits, adopted Cardoso's economic policies. Dilma is doing right now, again. The new finance minister of Brazil actually worked for the opposition candidate. He actually published last September an article in a series of papers telling what Brazil needed to do in order to rebalance fiscal accounts. It's precisely what he's doing. And it's going to be very tough, but there is no alternative. I personally believe it's going to succeed because of what you said. Public opinion in Brazil will not tolerate inflation back and will not tolerate a policy that does not take us, move forward. Now, a question is this: as you said recently in an interview to Folha, I think, well, the economic model is exhausted. We have to go back to an economic model driven by investment, no longer by consumption. We are done with that one. The second problem is that our presidentialism by coalition is kind of also exhausted because there's too much fragmentation and too much ineptitude in leadership. So it's not producing stability. It started to produce instability. Add to that the fact that the only with the silver lining here is that, as Boris Fausto wrote many times, we in Brazil move forward not by rupture but by accommodation. I think this is our national talent historically. How do you see the process moving forward from here? I share your optimism that I think we are going to do good things, or we are not going to waste this crisis. But how do you foresee things coming in the next couple of years, 3 years, into a situation where Brazil can really get out of this a much better country, a much more democratic country?
The next 2 years, thanks very much,
How are you going to
Paulo.
fix Brazil? That's
The next 2 years are going to be really tough because Dilma is the weakest president since the return to democracy, or maybe in Republican history in Brazil, because she has seen the PT delegation in the Chamber of Deputies being reduced by 18 members, right? So it has shrinked. So the PT controls only 14% of all deputies. Secondly, the legislative coalition supporting her in Congress is fragmented to an extent that is unheard of. The effective number of political parties, which is a concept that political scientists use, that weighs, doesn't count the nominal number of party, but weighs the share of seats that they have. So it's a complex formula. In Brazil now is 13.2%. It's the highest ever recorded, except for Russia under Yeltsin. So the degree of fragmentation in the legislature is really astonishing. The ideological heterogeneity also is really significant, which makes bargaining and negotiation, etc., very, very difficult. So she is also facing a major political scandal. the biggest political, the corruption scandal ever, with vast macroeconomic consequences, right? The oil and gas sector account for 13% of GDP, and Petrobras alone represents, according to some estimates, some 14% of investment in Brazil. So it is expected that gross capital formation will decline by 2 points just as a result of the paralysis of the oil sector and Petrobras and so on. So she's facing a major economic crisis. Her support base has been weakened. Her herself has no date because she won by a slim margin. So there's no reform mandate. Her platform was primarily a platform of continuation and that is the political difficulty in selling to the population this austerity program, because there are many examples in Latin America. Daniela Campello, in her forthcoming book, has identified 89 cases of major policy switch in Latin America. 89. Presidents that were elected on a platform and that implemented different projects and promises and so on. But this one is that Dilma's policy switch is really specific because her platform was a platform of continuation, and she vigorously defended her government. She was at the same time the president and the minister of finance, and at the same time that she was the chairwoman, Petrobras a chairwoman, and then there's no space for blame shifting on her part. So the next 2 years are going to be very difficult. But what's going to happen with the recently announced fiscal policies and so on that impose concentrated costs on key constituencies, pension, beneficiaries of unemployment benefits, and so on. She cannot address these segments of the population and justify these costs, right? At the same time that she renege all the idea that she defend others with what, right? So the next 2 years is going to be difficult. But what's going to happen? What is really interesting is that we are in Dilma Rousseff's second month. So it looks like a caretaker government, right? A weak government. And what's going to happen with these initiatives? Will they be blocked? There are two key elements when we consider what can happen that we should take into account, right? The first one is that the pivotal player now is the PMDB, right? The PMDB now controls the Senate and the speakership of the House, and has inflicted a number of defeats, has imposed the mandatory budget law, right, which was something that undermined a key instrument that the executive has used in Brazil under Lula and Cardoso, which is this pork for policy game, where, via budget amendments, And now that the federal deputies don't have to negotiate with the executive, but in order to have pork barrel projects approved, the president has no currency to bargain, right? So that undermines, weakens the presidency. So what's as I was saying, the PMDB is the crucial player. It has the agenda power now in the legislative, and it operates, and it's been operating since the beginning of the new government as a rival rather than a partner of the coalition. But the PMDB, despite the fact that it is the largest party in the coalition, it will bear no costs if the government fails. It is the most important partner of the PT, but all the political costs will be concentrated on the PT and on Rousseff. So this makes PMDB's threats credible, because they have nothing to lose if the governments fail. I mean, they're part of the government, but they are not seen as part of the government because all the government is identified primarily with the executive branch. And but the PMDB has no incentives really to bring down the government, despite the fact that the vice president would be, in case of impeachment, would be the current vice president from the PMDB. But even so, there's no incentives on the part of the PMDB to bring down the government. I think it's better for the PMDB to obtain all kinds of concessions from the president, and at the same time, because the PMDB can credibly threat to ruin the government, despite the fact that at the end of the day it will not do that. The cost, the toll that the PT and the president will have to pay, because the PMDB is the pivotal player, is quite substantial. So will the PMDB support the fiscal measures that are necessary to restore fiscal, restore confidence, business confidence, and restore fiscal sound fiscal management in Brazil? I think that the PMDB will do that, but will extract concessions, and they will come in terms of things that are already being negotiated in several areas, such as political reform. So PMDB's favored reform will in fact be put for a vote, not the PT's political reform based on closing the list in our open list proportional representation system, and that is the PT's reform agenda for that area. So that's gone. Also, in terms of various initiatives in the area of political reform, continue in this area. For example, private financing of political campaign will be allowed, and the PT has announced, the president has announced that we'll change the law in that area. So all these initiatives will be blocked, along with other specific in other areas, which has to do with quotas and also abortion, all initiatives that has to do with this more liberal agenda will be blocked. Will there be any space for any macro or microeconomic reforms? I don't think there'll be any space for that or initiatives in that direction. So in a way, we will not have a storm. Probably what you have will be a sort of business as usual, mild adjustment, fiscal, with no major initiatives or reforms in key areas such as.
So we have to wait for the next president.
We have to wait for the next president.
Right. Are there other comments? There's one right there. So.
We didn't stack the audience.
Could you
I'm
introduce
also,
yourself? Sorry.
Yeah, I'm also from the Brazil Institute. I'm a fellow at the Brazil Center at the Wilson Institute. Matthew Taylor. And thank you so much for coming, and it's great to have you here, and I love hearing your analysis always. I may be drawing wrong conclusions, so feel free to question the premise here, but I see two trends at work in Brazil. Beyond the Dilma Rousseff administration, but thinking over the past 30 years, if we think about the first trend is increasing heterogeneity in the coalition, which you described, and that is problematic and probably not a very healthy trend because it makes it very hard to govern. The second trend, though, is increasing accountability, and you've talked about this in your book about making Brazil work, of increasing checks and balances in Brazil and improving that. I see a conflict, though, between these trends, and I wanted to hear how you think that that will play out over time. The conflict that I see is that the heterogeneity of the coalition and coalition management means that for coalitional presidentialism to work in Brazil, you have to use tools that are different now than they used to be used. So no longer can you use pork, illicit campaign finance, or it's harder to use those things. And I think that the trend over the long term is for greater accountability, which will make it much harder to govern these coalitions. And as these coalitions become more heterogeneous, I wonder where you think that takes governability in Brazil. And so, you started out talking about Linz's nightmare scenario, and I think that that's a nightmare scenario that hasn't played out in Brazil, in part because there are so many informal instruments that can be used to govern. But now that those informal instruments are increasingly off the table, how will governability work? That's the first question. And then how do you think political reform, and at least what seems to be the winning political reform solution right now, will play out?
Yeah, so Zayed, one way to paraphrase that question would be, how can Brazil work without corruption? So anyway.
The first thing, the Linzian nightmare, right? I think that the good thing in Brazil is that we have multi-party coalitions, right? Multi-party coalitions, they are more inclusive. They are more conducive to accommodation and bargaining. And you don't have the winner-takes-all tension that you have in majoritary systems. And Latin America is primarily a region of multi-party coalitions as well, right? Brazil, the fragmentation has reached a level where the benefits of fragmentation, because there, in any institutional design, there's a trade-off, right, between inclusiveness and efficiency. So we reached the point where fragmentation has been so intense that the benefits that result from having multi-party governments that are more representative of the regional diversity, of the preference diversity in society and so on, has reached extreme. And in Brazil, interestingly, this is just a comment in passing, we now has reached this incredible fragmentation of 13 effective political parties, as a product of the intervention of the Supreme Court, not because of any societal demand for more representation and so on. So we have now too much fragmentation. So the net benefits of the current fragmentation are negative, right? But in that sense, we could speak of the ideal level of fragmentation. So it is better to have a fragmented polity because the checks on the presidency are stronger. And our historical challenge over the last century or so in Latin America is precisely to control presidential abuse of power. It is very different from the historical task of the US democracy, for example, where you have a weak presidency since the beginning of the republic. Multi-party coalitions and proportional representation has been crucial in Brazil. I'll give you just an example, intuitive example. In 1919 in Brazil, the president was elected with 99.7% of the vote. That was Epitácio Pessoa in his second. Not even Gaddafi has reached 99.7%. And the banner of the liberals under the old republic in Brazil was to introduce proportional representation in order to allow minorities to be represented in government and to be politically viable. And because we are federation, there are ample space in Brazil for the various political forces occupy political space at the subnational level in key cities and in key states and so on. So federalism in Brazil and proportional representation has been crucial in this process of controlling the presidency, and it is part of the dynamics that has led historically to strong checks and balances. But the level of fragmentation in Brazil has exceeded what that would require. And now we have cynicism as a result of, for example, the most conspicuously corrupt politician in Brazil, Maluf, shaking Lula's hand. So this kind of public a scene, of course, undermines legitimacy of coalitions. So to the eyes of the average citizen, this is totally unacceptable, or politics becomes a game, right, of insiders that care for their
even
own
though,
interests.
as you've argued, Brazil is in fact becoming more accountable and
Yeah.
less corrupt.
Yeah, and so the point is, fragmentation has been good for controlling the executive, for preventing abuse of power, right? But as I said, it is dysfunctional in Brazil. The level that we've reached is clearly dysfunctional.
And now you
Right.
don't have, the use of pork and so on to manage it. The use of
Although these pork barrel projects in general tend to have corruption deals within them, pork barrel is not illegal. It's not necessarily corruption, right? The land of pork barrel is the U.S., and that's nothing necessarily corrupt in attracting investment to your constituency.
There are a couple of other questions. I see three now. Let's do two at once. Let's do you, and then we'll do the third after that.
My name is David Fleischer. I'm a professor of political science at the University of Brasilia, and I'm a visitor here at George Washington University this semester. I'd like to take the discussion to a more practical level, which you might actually call nitty-gritty. in getting to your thesis of Brazil works, that institutions work, and that we have checks and balances, and that the judicial branch is strong. Recently, we've had a very, very nasty case of the president, the executive branch, trying to check the powers of the judicial branch. The investigations in Lava Jato, the corruption in Petrobras, are conducted by a very, as you say, competent federal judge in Curitiba, the federal police, and the federal prosecutors. Dilma has intervened with the TCU, the external control, and the CGU, the internal control, to take all of the power of plea bargaining and leniency discussions away from the judiciary and into the internal control, so that the judge, the prosecutors, and the federal police will no longer be able to do any plea bargaining or leniency negotiations, because we have some 20-some CEOs and CFOs from the largest construction companies in Brazil in some pretty tiny and miserable jail cells. And they are beginning to crack and beginning to sing. And the plea bargaining may be tremendous in terms of what it reveals. So my question is, you have institutions that work so that other institutions can't work. You have this intervention in the internal control and external control to prevent the judicial branch from functioning adequately. So that's my basic question.
And let's have one of you, fight it out between the two of you. So.
Hi, John Garrison from the World Bank and George Washington University. Good to see you again, Marcos. My question is related to Lula. What do you think his role in this process will be? I was reading the papers that he's in Brasilia today trying to convince the Workers' Party, the bancada and the Congress to vote for the fiscal adjustment packages. Will he be able to shore up Dilma's presidency, convince the social movements to support these austerity measures, and what's his own future? Thanks.
Sorry, John, I didn't quite catch the last.
Yeah, what's his future for 2018, the next election?
Okay.
Pick whichever piece of that you'd like to answer.
Right. Let me just return very quickly to what the second part of Matthew's question, political reform, right? I think there are real chances. Electoral reform are oxymorons, right? In the sense that by definition they should never occur, because they are voted by those that have benefited from this status quo. So in principle, they should never occur at all. But in the case of the PMDB right now, they're pressing for it. And I think there's a good chance of passing because of of how weak the presidency of the PT is and the president is. That could be part of and that would be absolutely disastrous, because what they're proposing, somehow naively, is it's called the Distritão. Technically, is the SNTV, the single non-transferable vote, that is currently adopted in Afghanistan, in Vanuatu, in Polynesia, and in Gibraltar. And it was used in Japan and Taiwan in the post-war period. So we will be joining that league if we go for that. That is perhaps the most extreme form of individualism in political representation, because it annihilates the power of parties. So this is one kind of reform that might happen in Brazil. What I anticipate for the next 2 years is no reform at all levels, except for reforms like that might pass, and that is a disaster. But we can. There are so many technicalities here that we could skip that. But passing now to Professor Fletcher's. My point here. My intention is not to present a rosy picture of Brazil. So what I argue is that Brazil compares favorably that dimension to all countries in Latin America. Perhaps in certain areas, on a par, or Chile would be better. And in current rankings, for example, there are 7 rankings of judicial independence in the literature by the World Bank, uh, in 5 of the 7, Brazil comes first or second, always on a par with Chile. In the 5 of the 7 rankings of judicial independence, right? In the IADB rank for the quality of public administration and the bureaucracy, it ranks first in all 3 dimensions, ahead of Chile, for example. And the bureaucracy is crucial also for checking. Usually in Brazil, when there are mismanagement or misdemeanor in many areas, their associations denounce bills and so on. That's what's currently occurring with the audit court, the TCU, right? The TCU technicians and bureaucrats, their association have been denouncing precisely what you mentioned. So, the TCU, in the only available ranking of Supreme Audit institutions, comes ahead of its Italian, Spanish, and slightly behind the French audit court, the Cour des Comptes. So it is regarded as highly professionally, state-of-the-art in terms of technology, what it does, and so on. But what I'm saying is, compared to its neighbors and countries with the same level of development, Brazil has much stronger checks and balance institutions, and that, along with the political competition, which is, in fact, explains part of this strength, and also the Brazilian federalism, this combination have virtuous effects on governance at all levels. So for every single case of a good example of control or punishment or sanctioning of misbehavior or investigation, it's always possible to find, cases where it never worked and so on. Or not everything is rosy, but compared to its neighbor, and that accounts for the fact that now we have the president of the presidential party in jail, along with 27 executives of the major construction companies in Brazil, companies that operate, for example, here. They built the Boeing hangar in Seattle was built by one of these contractors. Miami's monorail and Boston, they also participate in the Boston big public works in the Boston Common, the underground. So we're talking here about firms that are very, very important in their power and economic importance and so on. So this is really significant that this is occurring. Does it mean that in this case we have a good ending? It might be that not, but there are some elements that indicate that there will be punishment and corruption will be and sanctioned and so on. And I think what is going on right now is a direct product of the Mensalão scandal, because the Mensalão there was a lesson that was taken by all those involved in Mensalão, is that bankers can go to jail in Brazil. So the current president of the Banco Rural who was involved, this lady who is a dancer, right? She's a member of the family. She's been in jail for over a year now, and bankers can go to jail. And when the current contractors faced the possibility of having the same fate, they engaged in leniency deals. And because of these leniency deals, all the cartel and the immense corruption in cartel came to the fore. So it was the men's salon that made possible what's going on. And so I see this as a crescendo with some light at the end of the tunnel, in the sense that Brazil will institutionally be much stronger in 5 years' time than it is now.
One final question. There was one in the back. Yes.
Rick
Did you
O'Sullivan
wanna ask something?
with Change
and then
Management
Carl.
Solutions and a co-chair of the Civil Society Work Group at the Society for International Development, which, by the way, is going to be hosting an event with Legatum Institute this September on civil society and prosperity. One comment, when you said that the arrest of the president of a political party is unprecedented, clearly you've never been to Illinois, where there are 3 governors behind bars right now. My question is to look at a specific policy, if you don't mind, when you talk about the improvement in Brazil and looking at the shift away from protectionism in the economy, which was deeply ingrained into the Brazilian mindset. And there was a profound sea change in that policy, of not a complete reversal. And I'm curious as to could you explain how that came about? So profound a change in something that people thought was bedrock. I'd be fascinated. Thank you.
And then I'll ask you at the end.
Yeah, I skipped John's questions. I'm sorry, John, but
No.
yeah. I'm sorry,
We're just running out of time a little bit, so we have about 5 more minutes. Oh, and Carl wants to say something.
I'll be
before-
quick. I'm really struck by the absence of populism in Brazil, and maybe you could explain it, because there is a high degree of inequality.
Mm-hmm.
And is it because of the strength of the judiciary, and they do lock up bankers, that there isn't that kind of anger that populists could appeal to? And maybe you could just say a word about Brasilia and that type of program, and whether that has anything to do with it.
So you've got
yeah,
two or three points there you can make.
Protectionism, right? Cardoso in 1995, he presented 17 constitutional amendments. The first 7 had to do all with protectionist provisions in the Constitution of 1984. So it opened the ports for internal navigation. The monopoly in oil and gas, right, in the areas of distribution and production. It changed there was one constitutional amendment that changed the text of the Constitution that defined what was a Brazilian company. For those that speak Portuguese, a companhia de capital brasileiro, nacional. So it changed. So that was crucial for eliminating protectionism, right? And the reason why, under Lula, during Lula's second term of office, there was this return to protectionism, it has to do with the 2 external shocks. One was the pre-salt. The pre-salt raised expectations to a point where Petrobras launched the largest IPO ever in the history of capitalism, right? $78 billion. And it was a major. Brazil was predicted to be the first producer in the world by the economists in 2020. So all this optimism led to extravagant policies, right? And that was the reason why two things, two key innovations that turned out to be really bad now, with the hindsight, the benefit of hindsight, which was the local content, 80% that were required for all in all contracts. We're talking here about massive multi-billion dollar investments, right? And that was because local content exists everywhere, right? Statoil in Norway, they have local content requirements, but they are about 20%, 25% of local content, whereas in Brazil it reached 80%. The other thing has to do with the new Keynesianism, the idea that fiscal stimuli was when the situation in Brazil was really very different from the situation in the U.S. or in Europe, right? And led to this massive expansion of credit, irresponsible expansion of credit. BNDES became currently BNDES portfolio is $200 billion or something. It used to be 20. So 20. It grew at a rate, BNDES loans, at 25% per year. So this is an amazing level of expansion of credit to.
But so you're talking about why protectionism came back.
Yeah,
what
I
about
think it has
Carl's
to
question?
do with two external.
Yeah, you explained that.
No, it was
yeah.
And now returning quickly, I know we have just 5 minutes, to the why no populism in Brazil. When I mentioned the fact that the population became inflation avert, of course we have. It doesn't mean that we, because it could sound as if we have reinvented the law of gravity, right? Because political cycles exist anywhere. At the time of election, there's expansion of credit, employment. It's something that the political science literature has studied extensively in all countries and so on. Of course, the volatility of the cycle is much smaller in developed and mature economies. And this has to do also with this belief system. That people develop some notion that inflation can have really tremendous impact in their daily lives, as it did in Brazil. Steve Kaplan has a book on the politics of austerity in various countries in Latin America, and it makes a lot of sense. It speaks directly to your question. Why is it that in a number of countries, there was this inflation aversion belief? And Brazil is a case, is a point in case. It didn't happen in Venezuela or Ecuador. And in his view, this has to do, this explains partly what's going on in these two countries. And in other countries, like Argentina, there are other factors involved. But in some countries like Brazil and Chile, this became deeply ingrained. And so it's not that the political cycle or the redistributive pressure has been eliminated. They there, and no wonder Brazil has a GDP, a tax burden of 37% of GDP, which is the same level of Germany. right? It's above the OECD level because of pressures for fiscal redistribution. Brazil, by the time of the constitution, was being in 87, 89, Brazil, along with Sierra Leone, was the most unequal country on earth. So the pressures for distribution in Brazil was tremendous, and the expansion of social spending in Brazil, over the last 20 years, Brazil has been number one. Over the last 3 years, social spending in Argentina surpassed that level of Brazil, according to the CEPAL data. So inequality explains social spending in Brazil, but social spending has never generated fiscal deficits that would undermine fiscal. They've been financed by normal taxation, not by windfall profits like retenciones in Argentina or oil revenue in Venezuela. So they're sustainable. I think that I'll stop there. And a final point on Lula in 2018. Good question, but in my view, if the election had taken place in December, not October, IS would have won. Because only in December, some indicators came to the fore, and there was more visibility of the fiscal situation and so on. And even the only area where the current government has good things to point to are the employment level. So all the macroeconomic indicators showed a severe deterioration of the economy, right? These are common knowledge for all policy analysts in Brazil. All core voters in Brazil knew about that. But the swing voter, which is the average Brazilian, poor Brazilian, they care only about outcomes. And inflation was not entirely out of control, because tariffs had been repressed, and now they have to be restored to their normal levels, electricity and employment now, and this has to do with Matthew's question about the next 2 years. The employment situation would be dismal at the end of this year, because all the investments in infrastructure, we're talking here about a portfolio of $200 billion investments. Not talking about massive money, right? This has come to a halt, and this has affected employment massively. And this slowdown of the result of the combination of all these factors have already produced unemployment in the auto car industry. There has been dismissals, and the manufacturing industry is in dire straits. The employment level is really bad. Only services has been sustaining the employment level. But this is going to change dramatically over the next 1 to 2 years. So my returning to 2018, I said Dilma won because of the timing of the elections, right? The next 2 years is going to be really bad, and if this fiscal program rebalancing works, it will generate outcomes. And the man in the street, he cares only about good outcomes. in 2017. And that might be too late for Lula. And the damages on his, because of this massive corruption scandal, has been quite substantial. So I think that he's probably be a candidate, but I'll put my bets on an opposition candidate, because the next 2 years is going to be tough. And the memory of Dilma's policy switch, all policy switches in the past in Brazil during the democracy, Usado, right? Cardoso in 1998, when he devalued the real and so on. All these episodes led subsequently to sanctioning by by voters in subsequent elections. And this is going to happen with the PT in 2018. And despite Lula charisma and so on, there is of course, there's too much uncertainty and it's too early. But if we have to put put our my money on a bet, it wouldn't be in Lula.
So Brazil's voters will bring economically competent government to power, right? And on that note, inshallah. On that note, thank you all very much. It's been a really interesting conversation, and please continue it over coffee, now. Anyway, thank you.